Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Andrew McColl and I'm the Queensland Director of Family Voice Australia. I'd like to introduce our guest today, who is Lyle Shelton. Lyle is the National Director of Family First Party. Good afternoon, Lyle.
Good afternoon, Andrew.
Just some basic housekeeping before we start today. No doubt there'll be some of our viewers who'd like to put a question to Lyle today. So my plan will be to put some questions to Lyle, then after about 35 or 40 minutes or thereabouts, open up for some questions, which my Family Voice colleague, Peter Downey, will be able to monitor as the interview proceeds, and he'll put some of these to Lyle. So good to talk to you again, Lyle. It's a little while since I've seen you, and there was a bit of a gap in the traffic there, going back around about 35 years or so, I think, until the last time I saw you. So the fact that we were able to spend some time in a certain Christian school at Blackheath in the Blue Mountains, New South Wales, has sort of gone before us. So that was good. So just kind of filling in some gaps for our listeners, if you would, Lyle, what preceded your exposure to public life? Did you get involved in work? Were you involved much in tertiary studies?
Well, apart from having you as a high school teacher, Andrew, a few other things preceded as well. I suppose I've always had an interest in politics. That's something I've had from certainly from my high school days. As you might recall, you and I were involved in a church that was very interested in the political arena, and that very much got me thinking. Exposure to the likes of Francis Schaeffer and his film How Then Shall We Live. So I remember watching that as a young fella, becoming aware of the issue of abortion and the injustice of that back in the 1980s. So all these things started to fuel my interest in politics as a young person, realising that much of what we were seeing in terms of social and cultural breakdown was given license through the political process. And so as a young Christian, I thought that's something that I'd like to be involved in as I grew up. And so it was a natural interest that I pursued.
Right. So why did you run for the council in Toowoomba? Were there things happening there beforehand that bothered you?
Look, not particularly. It probably was more out of a desire to, as a Christian, engage the political process. So through my university days in Toowoomba, I ran for the student union, and I was elected to the student union, so that I was involved in student politics. I became a journalist working in rural journalism, and that also fueled my political interest because I was covering the political side of agricultural industry in Australia. So I met John Anderson when he was agriculture minister, or shadow agriculture minister at the time, then agriculture minister. So had exposure to politics. So by the time Toowoomba City Council election came along, that to me was just a natural progression from student politics to get involved in local government. And as a Christian, I was seeking to have influence there. And it just so happened, as I was running for council, the state government under the then Labor Premier Peter Beattie was decriminalising or making legal brothels, places where young women particularly, could be exploited by men with the sanction of the state. And that impacted on local government because the way the law was crafted meant that local councils had no choice but to approve complying brothel applications. So that came up as an issue during the campaign that I was running in. And so I became outspoken on that issue. So straight away, as I launched my sort of local government career, I found myself involved in a big cultural battle.
So you're living in Toowoomba at the time. What was that like, facing that in that fairly substantial country town for you?
Yeah, Toowoomba, whilst it's a city, it's a big country town, as you rightly say. And so to be outspoken on an issue like that, a moral issue, even though it was very much a town planning issue as well, was challenging because you couldn't walk down the street in Toowoomba without running into someone you knew. Apart from a couple of years living in Blackheath where we met, I'd grown up in the city, had gone to university there, started my career there. So I knew a lot of people and was well known in the city, of course, being elected. So yes, that was challenging, but I felt it was necessary because to impose on a city like Toowoomba brothels where our local young women could be exploited by men in a very harmful trade was something which I believe needed to be spoken about. And the speaking about that was awkward, it was controversial, but I believe it was necessary. So that was just one of the prices that one had to pay to speak up in the public square.
Okay. So what do you think you kind of learned from that experience?
That's a good question. I learnt that that lots of people will support you in these things, but don't really want it talked about publicly. So even some of my council colleagues would say to me privately, yes, you're right, Lyle, but when I brought the issue into the council chamber, into the public arena, they would vote against me. So they would say one thing to your face and then another thing in the glare of the public gaze. And that was a very hard and difficult lesson.
Okay, so you were there in the council there for 6.5 years, and you'd encountered some insults and probably accusations in those years in local government. And had that prepared you for what you kind of encountered in Canberra with ACL? Yeah,
very much so. I guess you don't know how your life is going to progress, and as a Christian, as someone of faith, you see God's hand and his providence in the things that, the experiences in life that he gives you. And obviously the council was an amazing experience, 6.5 years in local government. Yes, it's not parliament, it's not state parliament, it's not federal parliament, but it's still government. The principles are the same. You're interacting a lot with the other two levels of government, and it's still very political. So that was very much a terrific training ground for the next phase of my life, which was to then go and spend 10 years as a lobbyist in our nation's capital in Canberra, walking the halls of Parliament House, meeting politicians, everyone from the Prime Minister down, we had access to at different times during those 10 years. And so certainly the experience in local government was very helpful in preparing me for that next stage of my career as a lobbyist.
So you would have encountered there some accusations, some insults from people that would have been fairly new for you?
Look, any sort of politics is robust, particularly, but more so if you engage, as I said before, so-called moral issues. I don't see them as, all issues are moral. Moral simply means there's right and there's wrong. And if you're talking about whether it's justice in terms of, how we should, as a society, treat young women, whether it's the human rights of the unborn, whether it's the definition of marriage, these social and cultural, so-called culture war issues are ones which evoke a lot of emotion, particularly from the left of politics, and the left and the libertarian right both hold, these cultural issues as sacrosanct and wanting to progress what they see as progress by what I see as deconstructing our social fabric. It evokes a lot of emotion and therefore a lot of insults, particularly in the social media world. And of course, from 2007 onwards, when I was starting to get engaged in the Canberra scene, social media was on the rise, Facebook, Twitter. So yeah, you get a lot of online hatred.
Okay. So when you went down to Canberra with ACL, did you find that was just a sort of logical step up, or was that a kind of night and day transition?
Look, so I wouldn't say it's night and day, because whilst my time on the council, that wasn't just fighting culture war issues. There was obviously, run-of-the-mill local government town planning, off-leash dog parks, stormwater drainage, dams, roads, all of these sort of things, which I found interesting, and you had to apply yourself to those issues. But it was good preparation going into the Canberra situation. Obviously, I wasn't an elected person. I was coming into the political process from the outside as a lobbyist, but having had some understanding of the machinery of government, albeit at a local council level, the principles are translatable. Just the issues are different. Canberra deals with national security, trade, foreign affairs, and also some of these cultural issues as well. So we would find ourselves presenting at Senate inquiries into abortion issues, whether abortion should be funded by Medicare. We were involved in a lot of law reform. So, for instance, the then Rudd government was removing discrimination against same-sex couples as part of, their intent at the time was to try and avoid redefining marriage, but to give same-sex couples civil rights, I suppose, is the way that they would call it, so that there would be no need to change the definition of marriage. So we're involved in a lot of those sort of issues during that time in Canberra. So it was very interesting work. It was controversial, but as I say, the local government experience was good preparation for it. Good. So you served in that first role for 5 years as chief of staff, and then you hoped you could handle stepping up to the role of the MD. How did you find that? It was a big step up. I was very privileged in that first 5 years in Canberra to work under an amazing man by the name of Jim Wallace, a former brigadier in the Australian Army. Right. And he very much mentored me through that period. And it was a privilege of my life to work under a man of his incredible calibre. He wanted to then transition the organisation. So after 5 years, I stepped into the managing director's role, and he became chairman of the board. So we remained in close contact and working together, but albeit in a different capacity, him in a non-executive role, me in the executive role. But that was a big step up and a big challenge. But it was a great opportunity as well. And we were privileged to see ACL continue to grow during that period. And then I found myself involved at the epicenter of the same-sex marriage debate as activists pushed for the change to the definition of marriage, and ACL being one of the few groups in the country. Family Voice was involved and others, but we were one of the few voices speaking into that space. So we found ourselves very much involved in that 2017 plebiscite. And so transitioning to that managing director's role caused me to find myself in a position where we were playing a role on the national stage in a very, very big public policy debate. So you've gone from dog parks to concrete drains and parks in the city to a scale of the whole national policy and legislation, which is, but as you say, there are some similarities in terms of the two forms of government. One's is very local and very kind of domestic stuff, but meanwhile back at the ranch, we can understand that there is that sense of preparation for you in that work in Toowoomba. So after the bombing of the ACL building, did you conclude that the AFP had been politicised? It's hard for me to say for sure, but for people who may not be aware of that, in 2016, just a few days before Christmas, our office was bombed by a same-sex marriage activist. We didn't know that at the time, but this fellow filled a rental van with gas cylinders, took it to our office at about 10 o'clock at night and detonated it, and blew up the van. It caused a massive firestorm, which smashed pretty much all the windows on the ground floor of the office, and cracked windows on the second floor where my office was. There was molten glass stuck to the carpet, $100,000 worth of damage done to the building. And the very next day, the Australian Federal Police conducted a media conference where they said there was no political, religious, or ideological motivation for what had happened the previous night. Now, those words are really important because under the Attorney General's Department, that's the definition of domestic terrorism. So they were going out of their way the next day to say, this is not a terrorist incident. This was just some poor fellow who randomly was trying to commit suicide and just happened to drive up to the ACL's building where he wanted to kill himself. The fellow who did it survived the initial blast with massive burns to his body. The police did interview him that night. And we found out months later through the court process that in that interview, just prior to him being put into an induced coma, he was badly injured. He told the police that he hated the ACL, that he hated religion. He disagreed with our views on sexuality. Now, we found this out months later, but if you then go back to the media conference that was done by Commander Mark Walters of the Australian Federal Police the next day, he was obviously not telling the truth because he knew what was in that interview recording conducted the night before, but the very next day said there was no political, religious, or ideological motivation. So whether there was political interference, I do not know. But to this day, I believe the Australian Federal Police were involved in a cover-up. I've written about this in my book. We tried to pursue it through friends in the Parliament, through Senate estimates, but we were steamrolled. And unfortunately, the poor fellow who committed the act later, so October in 2017, he took his own life. So a second attempt, and he took his own life, which meant that the court process was unable to be concluded. So I guess we'll never really get to the bottom of it, which I think is a great shame. But it really shook my faith in the institution of the Australian Federal Police, that they were very quick to cover it up. And even when evidence came out in court to suggest that what they'd said the day after the bombing was not true, they've never owned up to this.
Right. Because that policy of covering up something that's a little bit embarrassing for certain people, I noticed early this year when they had the march on Canberra, and there were however many hundred thousands, if not more, came in that march to Canberra, and there were people there from Childers and all sorts of, and they had gone something like 20 hours in the motor car to get there. And I heard the AFP were interviewed by some senators, and they asked the AFP, "Oh, how many people did you think were in the crowd?" And the AFP said, "Oh, probably 6,000 or 8,000." Mm. And it seemed to me to be a really astonishing statement to make when the footage from the drones was indicating there had to be hundreds of thousands of people there. And so for them to say 6,000 or 8,000 looked like it was a sort of procured number that just suited certain people. It was seemed to be a long way from the truth. And I just formed the impression then that these people have been got it. They're just giving the answer that someone told them to give.
Look, it's hard to know, Andrew. And look, I desperately want to have confidence in the institutions of this nation because that's really important to a civil society. But certainly my confidence was shaken in the AFP after what happened at our office. I noted Chris Uhlmann's reporting of that rally in Canberra, and he certainly indicated, and Chris is no right-wing usual suspect. He's a well-respected Canberra Press Gallery journalist with the Nine Network, or he's just retired now. But he certainly indicated that there's certainly a much bigger crowd than what was there. So look, I think it's really important. There's a lot of, I guess, what we would call woke influence on all sorts of institutions today, including on the police. And I think it's really important that all of our institutions remain impartial and above politics and do their jobs serving the community. And I think that's one of the real dangers of where we've come to as a society today, where woke politics is now influencing everything, and it's something that needs to be rectified.
Yeah. Okay. So just thinking along those lines, I was going to ask you what's your assessment of our situation in Australia today?
I think the country's in grave danger. I think we're heading in the wrong direction. on a range of fronts. Our economic policy is heading in the wrong direction. Our debt is way too high, and there's no sensible plan to rein it in. As John Anderson, one of my heroes, keeps saying, we keep spending our children's and our grandchildren's money. Our energy policy is a mess. There's no engineering rationale for installing windmills and solar panels whilst closing down coal-fired power stations and gas-fired power stations. It's just, the technology just does not exist to power a modern economy on wind and solar, as nice as all that might sound. And so we're seeing our electricity prices go through the roof. We're seeing our electricity grid already unstable, and it's going to get worse, particularly here in New South Wales when the Liddell power station closes next April. So on an economic front, we've got dangers looming. And on a social policy front, as it applies to families, this has been on a slow burn, at least for the last 50 or 60 years, all of my lifetime. But we've seen the breakdown of families, divorce, obviously the influx of pornography, abortion, and now same-sex marriage, redefining how we see the rights of children, and then of course the transgender movement, which is now just completely redefining what it actually means to be a human creature, male or female. So these things are causing problems, they're causing harm, particularly the transgender issue is causing harm to children and young people, and of course obviously abortion takes the life of a baby and obviously hurts women. So we've got lots of problems in terms of social and economic policy in this nation. And sadly, we don't seem to have the political leadership that's willing to take it on and to paint a more positive vision of economic and social flourishing.
So do you think that what took place in Victoria with their election recently is somehow symptomatic of our position nationwide?
Yes, it is, because there's a lack of leadership. And in Victoria, we saw two leaders who believed exactly the same thing. Daniel Andrews, very clear about his social and economic agenda. Matthew Guy, believing all the same things. I mean, let's take, two litmus test issues. The so-called gay conversion therapy law, the Change and Suppression Act, which the Andrews government passed, which the Liberals abstained from, which is as good as supporting it. That's a bill that, or an act now, an act of Parliament, where in Victoria, it's against the law for a parent to dissuade their own child from going off to a gender clinic to have puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or irreversible surgery, with jail sentences applying. So you had Daniel Andrews and Matthew Guy both supporting that law. Matthew Guy said it's a good bill and it will stand if he was elected premier. So the choice that people had in Victoria was overt evil with Daniel Andrews, and well, they're both overt. They're both supporting really, really bad legislation. They're both supporting closing down the baseload power infrastructure of Victoria in the forlorn hope that somehow windmills and solar panels could power a manufacturing, an advanced economy. So they both offered the same thing. So one guy strong, one guy weak. Human nature is that they're going to go for the strong leader, and that's exactly what they did.
Yeah. So when you've talked to believers in your public life, and you've obviously been willing to be pretty forthright about your views in a public space, what kind of responses have you found from Christian leaders or ministers and from believers as a whole?
Look, Orthodox Christian leaders, when I say Orthodox, small O Orthodox, people who believe traditional Christianity, not the small declining liberal section of the church, but those that still hold to the Bible, as Cardinal Pell calls them, the Bible Christians, which span Protestants and Catholics and the capital O Orthodox. Leaders certainly agree with the concerns that people like myself have, and would agree with what Family Voice, ACL, and others who are speaking up. They would agree with these views, but very few are willing to speak in the public square. And that's been a huge disappointment to me over my time as a Christian lobbyist and activist. There's few leaders that are willing to speak because they're worried about cancel culture. They're worried about the backlash they might get. But at a grassroots level, we found during our time at ACL tremendous hunger amongst rank and file Christians for people who will speak up. And so ACL developed a very big following. I know Family Voice has got a healthy following. The rebirthed Family First Party, which I'm now involved in, has a growing and healthy following because people are looking for leadership in these cultural issues. They know that our nation's going in the wrong direction. They know that we need to have voices pointing to the truth. And so people are at a grassroots level are responding to that on a very large scale. And I would really like to see more leaders with the courage to speak up, not even necessarily into the public space. That would be good. But I think there's a real need for leaders of churches to be more proactive in helping form their young people. Young people are very confused in this current age because of the messages they're getting from the culture, from social media, from the universities. There's a lot of intellectual confusion, and I think we've got to do a better job at forming the minds of our young people so that their thinking is clear. The Bible tells us to love the Lord with all our heart, our soul, and our mind. I think, particularly in the Pentecostal world, we do a good job at loving the Lord with our heart and our soul, but the mind is left in neutral too often. So there's a big task for leaders in forming the next generation, and that requires courage and the ability to speak from the platforms that they have. And I've noticed there's a reticence to even use the platforms that they have to talk about some of these thorny cultural issues, which is a real worry.
Yeah. I've been in this job since May this year, and I've been travelling around southeast Queensland, gone up as far as Rockhampton, and I've noticed that there seems to be a kind of a kind of timidity amongst ministers. And I had one minister say, "Look, we have to preach the gospel," of which all of us would agree. But by when he said that, he was really inferring he didn't want to get into these conflicting views or conflicting issues that would push him out somewhere in a public space where he mightn't be that comfortable, and he might even face ridicule. And I've been thinking since that time, what's happened to ministers that they thought that they could actually be a preacher of the gospel, yet never face public censure or challenge or insults and accusations when the whole history of the New Testament is people like Paul going places and immediately there's trouble. And he jumps into things left, right, and centre, faces immediate and often violent conflict, and seems to think it's just kind of natural for him to have to encounter these things. Whereas our modern training of ministers seems to, well, I don't know whether it's just the training or whether it's the men, but they don't want to do that. They think they can preach a nice message on a Sunday, and some people will shake their hand and go home. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, the culture continues to decline. Yeah.
No, look, that's exactly right. And I think the problem is our definition of the gospel. The gospel isn't just our own personal salvation. It is that, but it's far more than that. That's a truncated version of the gospel. And if pastors think that they don't need to talk about marriage, family, maleness, femaleness, the Bible is a book about everything. It covers all of life, and of course, Christ's kingdom is all encompassing. And the idea that we can separate a pietistic aspect of our faith, that is our devotional life and what we do on Sunday, and then the rest of the week, that's up to something else. That's not a proper understanding of Christianity. My favourite theologian is an Anglican by the name of Tom Wright, who's at St Andrews University in Scotland these days. But he traces this problem back to the Enlightenment, where he says the Enlightenment put God upstairs and left the realm of intellect, rationale, the running of society to the downstairs domain. And that was the pact that the church even bought into, that secular man would run the world, run downstairs, and upstairs would be God and the Christian thing, and that's all fine. It stays up there in its box, but down here leave the affairs of running society to the realm of man. And the church has even bought into that, and that's why you'll have preachers who'll say, yeah, we just want to preach the gospel, we're just going to do our upstairs thing, and leave the running of the world to others. Now, I'm not, by saying that, advocating a theocracy, but what I am saying is what Christians have always done and always should do, is see the gospel applying to all areas of life. There's an ethic that goes with the gospel, an ethic of love, of integrity, and that means being engaged in everything where there's injustice, bringing justice to it, and that could be how a local council is run, or how a dispute is sorted out in a court, or whether or not you have a law that allows a young woman to be exploited with the sanction of the state in a legalized brothel. So all of these things, are part of the gospel, which is good news. And laws can bring good news to a society or bad news, and we've got a lot of laws that are bringing bad news, and that's not the application of the gospel, and that's why we should be engaged and should be involved in everything, not just relegating Christianity to some upstairs religious domain.
Well, I think those are very important conclusions that come to, and I've, looking at, say, German history in the 1930s, where the German church was confronted with a powerful, dynamic leader who was going to sort out their problems, was going to right the wrongs of history, and he managed to convince a large proportion of the church in the 1930s in Germany that this would be the solution. And one of the things that Hitler did was he actually appealed to sort of national pride and patriotism, which of course most people want to grab onto and say, yeah, I'll be for that. And yet, and at the time there was this sacred, as you're saying, with upstairs, downstairs, there's a sort of sacred secular dichotomy where you say, up there is God, Jesus, the Bible, church, and maybe the family, but down here there's all the other stuff. And there's, prostitution and abortion and problems and tax and economics. That's all pretty ugly stuff. We don't want to deal with that. We'd rather deal with the upstairs stuff, God, Jesus, the Bible, church, and family, and stop there. Well, that's a recipe for disaster, as it turned out to be in Germany. One of the best symbols of that is a picture of Berlin in 1945, and it's just a mass of rubble. And that is, in my opinion, that's where we're kind of heading towards, unless the church itself is able to sort of say, whoa, what have we been doing for 50 years, 80 years, 100 years? Have we been just sort of marking time where our culture is heading downhill fast, and we've just said, oh, well, God, Jesus, the church, Bible, and family? Well, it hasn't been enough.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Look, in the early 1930s in Germany, there were 18,000 Protestant pastors, Lutheran pastors, essentially. 3,000 of those went with Dietrich Bonhoeffer and his confessing church in opposing the Nazis, who were trying to relegate a racist clause into the way the church appointed leaders, the so-called Arian clause that said Jews couldn't be leaders in the church, and there were a number of Jews who were converts to Lutheranism, and so that meant they couldn't hold positions of leadership. Bonhoeffer said, no, we must reject this, because that's not the gospel. The gospel's for all people, all races. 3,000 pastors went with the confessing church, 3,000 went with the Reichskirche, and 12,000 sat in the middle and were silent. And I think that's where we are today. We've got a small group that are, realizing, hey, we have to engage the culture where there's injustice, where children are being told lies about their gender, et cetera, to use that litmus test issue. And then we've got, others that have gone along with the culture, the liberal church, where you can talk about the Uniting Church, which now agrees with same-sex marriage. And then you've got the vast bulk of Christians and Christian leaders sitting silently in the middle. And Eric Metaxas, who writes so eloquently about all this, says that the price of speaking up only gets higher the longer that we are silent. And this is the dilemma of the Australian church. We're sitting here in silence. It's not going to get easier to speak the longer we are silent. It's only going to get harder. And we're seeing that at the moment with the pressures on freedom of speech and freedom of religion that have only accelerated since the definition of marriage was changed in law, and that caused the weaponisation of state-based anti-discrimination laws. So we are very much heading down a similar track. Always challenging to make parallels with the 1930s. Of course, I'm not suggesting there's going to be a Holocaust or anything like that, but the principles are translatable, and we must learn the lessons of history.
So just getting back to your situation, rather more kind of privately, how you're feeling about Family First, and how did you find that work in Victoria?
Yeah, look, I'm really encouraged by the rebirth of Family First. The party started some 20 odd years ago, but has been closed down for a number of years. It merged back in 2017 with Corey Bernardi's Australian Conservatives. That didn't prove to be a successful venture. But then late last year, early this year, two former Labor parliamentarians from South Australia, Jack Snelling, a former Treasurer of South Australia, and Tom Kenyon, a former Minister in the Weatherall government, both men now out of Parliament, but both had considerable parliamentary experience, and Roman Catholic men, pro-life men. They decided to see if they could get the party reformed, and did so. I joined in May, June of this year, and we're working to get the party set up right around the nation once again, so that the values of family and marriage, religious freedom, pro-life are on the ballot paper at every election that occurs in Australia from here on. That's our aim. So we ran in the South Australian election. We've just run in the Victorian election. Both South Australia and Victoria, we've only just missed out on getting people into the parliament. The Victorian upper house votes were declared today. We've just missed out by a whisker in getting people into the upper house, but we achieved 3.1% of the vote statewide, which was the highest of all the other minor parties in that election. So we came after Labor, Liberal, Independents, Nationals. Family First was next. So we did pretty well, and it's shown that there's an appetite for what we are standing for, and I'm really encouraged about the future of Family First, and we're just determined to keep building. It might take us a couple of electoral cycles to see people in the parliament, but just having the voice out there, having the values, competing at elections on the ballot paper, I think is absolutely necessary, and it gives people hope and something to fight for.
Great. So you've served the Lord, Lyle, as a husband and father, and now as a grandfather. You've been involved in local government in a public context, then spent 10 years with ACL in Canberra. So for those of us considering a public profile such as government or politics, what suggestions do you have?
I think it's important to know that you're called to this. It's not everyone's bag, but I think there are many more people that God is wanting to call to a life of public service. I would encourage people, particularly if they're young, to start preparing now, no matter how young you are. Start by reading, understand history, politics, theology, Christian worldview. The Australian Christian Lobby, where I was for 10 years, has some terrific courses for young people. Martin Isles runs a short course called The Download, where a number of Christian academics come and speak into these difficult cultural areas from a philosophical, theological perspective. Very, very helpful. And of course, ACL's got the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, which is a 3-month live-in course for people who are at university or postgrad. So I'd certainly encourage people to take advantage of those types of courses, and then look for good mentors. Christians in politics who can mentor you, get experience working in a politician's office. Follow the work of groups like Family Voice and ACL and Family First. There's lots of terrific commentators in America and the UK that are worth following as well. Come up to speed with the cultural debates, understand the issues well, and start writing and learning to articulate them. That would be my advice in a nutshell.
Sounds good, Lyle. Well, Peter, do you have any questions that have come in from our viewers today for Lyle?
I do. The first one's from Kevin, and it says, is Family First completely opposed to abortion, or are they just wanting to ban late-term abortion? Family Voice website mentioned these 2 points below in the run-up to the Victorian election, and it confused me and others. So these are the 2 points: to protect pain-capable unborn babies by banning late-term abortions, and banning sex selection abortion. So you might want to clear the air for us, Lyle.
Yeah, sure, Peter. And thanks to Kevin for that question. Family First is unashamedly a pro-life political party, but we also recognise that if we were to put up a bill into, so let's say, for instance, we were successful in getting a couple of people into the Victorian Upper House, we would not be successful in getting a bill to ban abortion. You just wouldn't have the numbers there for it. But you would potentially gain support for banning sex selection abortion, for banning the coercion of women. So there are things that can be done to wind it back, if I can use that terminology. And as part of that, help people understand and educate them about what this issue is, because there's a lot of misinformation, as we know, from our media and our culture, and bring people to a stage where they fall in love again with the unborn. So look, our position is absolutely pro-life, but if we're taking policies to an election, it would be first to wind things back. Even William Wilberforce, the great anti-slave campaigner, parliamentarian in Britain back in the 18th and 19th century, he worked on an incremental approach to wind things back. It didn't mean that he supported slavery in any way, shape or form, but he certainly worked incrementally to wind things back. And I think that's a legitimate tactic to take in the abortion debate. We'll never concede that abortion is right or moral, and obviously we would like to see it abolished, but that's going to take some time.
Thank you, Lyle. I've got another question. Are you running in New South Wales in March?
Yes, I will be, and you heard it here first. I haven't officially announced that to our supporters, but look, I've been doing due diligence over the last little while. I've just come back from 3 months in Victoria, but it is my intention to run as an independent candidate for the upper house of the New South Wales Parliament. We can't, unfortunately, register Family First in time for the New South Wales election. The New South Wales rules are different to Victoria. We were able to register within a period of months in Victoria, and that's just the way their Electoral Commission rules are. Here in New South Wales, they're very strict and they require a 16-month lead time. Now, that meant we would have had to have started, last year, and that was, well before, Family First was in a position to do that. So our only option here is for someone like myself to run as an independent, but we'll do that, using Family First infrastructure, supporters, and really with the aim to keep building the movement, to keep getting experience in election, raising volunteers, road testing our capability. This is not a short-term project. We don't believe there's a quick fix that we can, get people into parliaments quickly. It is going to take time. It's going to take effort. It's going to take strategy. And part of that is ensuring that we're able to improve our capacity election by election. Now, there's always an outside chance someone can be elected, and obviously that would be our hope, and we'll work hard for that. But I also want to be realistic about the prospects as well. And we very much want to see this as an opportunity to build the capacity of the party and put ourselves in a stronger position for the next election, which will be the federal election in 2025. Also, we'll be looking at territory, state elections in Queensland, etc. So it's all about building the movement. We have to get ourselves ready. We have to prepare, and it's going to take a long runway for that. And we'll be looking to this New South Wales election as part of that strategy.
Thank you, Lyle. There's a question: what colour will your supporters' shirts be? I don't know how that is. But...
Wait and see.
Okay, my last question is: what is the best strategy for Christians to bring about positive change?
Gee, that's a big question. Strategies. There's people far more qualified than me to talk about strategy. Look, I think we need lots of voices in the public square, and lots of different organisations, not siloed, but working together in a coordinated way as much as possible. So you definitely need your advocacy groups like Family Voice, like ACL, like the Australian Family Association. We need concentrated force being applied to the problems, and those groups need to prosper and to grow. And then you obviously need political capacity at election times, and that's what I've felt has been the missing ingredient on the battlefield. Having been in the advocacy space for many, many years, I felt we really need the political apparatus of a party. I feel like the Liberal Party has very much let us down. Now, I hasten to say part of the strategy has got to be good people working within the Liberal Party. And I know many Christians, and I have many friends that are working there. So for me, it's not an either or strategy, it's a both and. You need the people working within the major parties, but you also need a political party like Family Voice working from the outside of the major parties as a minor party influence. We can say and do things that people in the Liberal Party are either not courageous enough to say and do, or are not allowed to say and do. And so we can have that influence in the same way the Greens have had an influence on the left of politics over the last 30 years. We want to have an influence on the centre-right to bring a balance back to things, and particularly to help the Liberal Party be its best self. So you need that potency that comes from a party apparatus, but you also need it coming from the advocacy groups. So that's how I see the strategy working. Lots of voices applying effort into the space in different ways, but all necessary functions.
Yeah, thank you, Lyle. Back over to Andrew.
Well, look, thank you, Lyle, for sharing with us today. I'm excited about you and your run in the New South Wales election, and we wish you well for that. And do you have any concluding comments to make to us this afternoon?
Well, thank you, Andrew and Peter. It's been great to be able to share. It's a real privilege. I do want to leave people with hope. I know that the things that we all talk about and are bringing to people's attention are often very negative issues, and that's sadly that's the world we're in. These issues are real. They're out there. People need to be informed about them, and I think it's great the work that's done to help people understand how bad the culture is, and it is bad. But on the other hand, we want to cast a better vision, not just a reactionary one. But if we are for things, and we're for the family, we're for marriage, we're for the flourishing of children, we're for justice in our society, integrity in politics, all of these good things, truth, beauty, and goodness. If we're for these things, it does mean that we have to take a stand against the things that are corrosive to those good things. And so that's why I'll never apologise for highlighting that which is wrong, that which is, in my view, evil. And I know Family Voice does the same, and ACL and many others. We need those voices. We need to highlight that. We need to do the work of awakening people to the situation. But then we need to get on the front foot and say, okay, well, how do we eat the elephant here? How do we tackle these problems and cast a more compelling vision that will then overcome the evil. And I think that's our challenge, and that's certainly what I want to do in my role in Family First, is to say, hey, there's a better way for us to go as a society. There's a better economic plan. There's a better plan for our energy future, our cost of living, our housing affordability. We can do much better in terms of protecting our children from things that will harm them. We can do much better in rebuilding a culture of marriage and family, which we know has overwhelming positive benefits. Kids do best whenever they have the opportunity to be raised by their biological mother and father, wherever that's possible. But at the moment, we don't even shoot for that aspiration. We don't even talk about it. It's a taboo subject because of political correctness and because we're afraid of offending the sensibilities of those who might be pursuing alternative lifestyles. And look, people are free to do what they want to do in a free society, but we should also be courageous and bold about talking about what we believe to be the best, in the best interests of the child and the best interests of men and women in terms of their relationships and what will cause those relationships to flourish. And we should be encouraging governments to enact public policy that causes marriage and family to flourish. And so it's finding a way to articulate that hopeful, positive vision. That's the challenge that we have, and that's what I want to leave people with is my commitment to do my best through the organisation that I'm a part of, and as I work with others around the country like Family Voice and others, that we are able to cast a more hopeful and positive vision that then makes these other alternative views less attractive to our population. And with God's help, I believe we can see that happen. And it's absolutely vital that we do, because the future of our nation is very much at stake.
Thank you, Lyle, for taking the time to be with us today, and we wish you well for next year and your role in New South Wales with Family First, and it's been great talking to you again. God bless.
Thank you, Andrew. God bless you too, and a Merry Christmas to you and to everyone who's taken the time out to watch this webinar today. God bless you all.